I'm here today to talk about the most serious problem facing higher education. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, and absolutely no, all you have to do is just explanations. I'm here today to talk about how racism is so deeply embedded in the structures and practices of higher education that it's invisible, and its most injurious impacts on minoritized faculty, staff, and students look normal. But first, a story. I'm going to tell you about a student who used to frequent the center I used to lead. More about that center later. Maria, not her name, was a new American who had come to this country when she was a young child. Maria used to drop by my office often to talk about how much she loved Villanova and learning. You see, when she first came to this country, she didn't speak English very well. So she studied hard and ultimately was able to secure a spot for herself in the most prestigious charter school in her neighborhood. And it was there that she developed her love of science and determined that she was going to be a scientist. And as she told me and everybody in the center, she graduated #1 in her class. Now, Maria was supposed to have an appointment to come and see me, but that never stopped her. She frequently burst into my office to tell me the good news of her day. However, as time went on, I began to see her less and less until finally, toward the end of her second year, she dragged into my office and said she wanted to ask me a question. I could tell that this was no easy question. I asked her to sit down, but instead she stood in front of my desk with her fists balled up and said, "Why did they lie to me, Dr. Nance? They told me I was smart, but I'm not. Why did they lie?" Maria had just been told that she needed to leave her major and select a less demanding one. Maria's sense of betrayal was because she had done everything she was supposed to do. Through elementary school and high school, she had taken every course, she had studied hard, she had even taken the most demanding courses in her discipline. She had gotten into Villanova and into the science major of her dreams. But as she stood before me that day, I could see the dream dying in her eyes. It is Maria's haunting question that brings me here today. Even though there are no more hate-filled name-calling crowds shouting at students like James Meredith or the Little Rock Nine, racism that existed on our campuses back then is still there. We see that the biggest problem here is racism and the inequities it produces. And the solution is equity and anti-racism. My name is Terry Nance. I've been at Villanova for more than 40 years. And in that time, I've been a faculty member, a department chair, and an administrator in student life and now in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Over the years, colleges and universities have worked to produce equity and opportunity for minoritized students. Though much has changed, too much has remained the same. We need change, a change that recognizes the role of race in the institution. So let's get started. There's no better way to start than with a definition. And this one comes from Professor Ibram X. Kendi, who defines racism as the marriage between racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. So let's take that part just a little bit. A racist policy is any policy that maintains racial inequities. A racist idea is any notion that supports the idea that one group is superior and another group inferior. And finally, racial inequity is when any two racial groups are not standing on approximately equal ground. So what does that look like in higher ed? Well, let's take it this way. Let's suppose all people are born with basically the same human qualities. So then why is it normal that in higher education, according to the Chronicle on Higher Education, that Black enrollment reached its peak in 2010 and has declined by more than 13%? Why is it normal in higher education that just over half of Black and Latin students graduate in 6 years, as opposed to 70% of white students. And why? Is it normal that with a diploma in hand, Black students will earn 15% less and be 2/3 more likely to be unemployed? Well, the answer is that it is not normal. But because we have taken it to be that way, the following facts are also true. 1 year out, Black graduates, median income, $36,000. White students, $40,000. Now that's a $4,000 difference. I want you to hold on to that fact. Now, while they were in school, 86% of Black students took out loans, compared to 67% of white students. And the debt load of Black students, $37,000. The debt load for white students, $31,000. So that $4,000 salary difference I talked about before is much greater. And imagine what that is over time. Faced with data like these, American Council on Education President Ted Mitchell said, communities of color have made great educational headway over the last several decades, but we must maintain focus. Substantial and persistent inequities remain. If we think we're going to be able to address those substantial and persistent inequities with diversity solutions, we are wrong. We must confront, challenge, and eliminate the racial inequities that lie at the heart of the major problems in higher education today. Now, no problem this big can be handled without a real sense of the big picture. And for that, I'm going to give you an iceberg of racism in higher education. Now, if you look above the line are racial inequities. And these I have already talked about and will talk about later. They are provable, we can quantify them, we know they exist. But what lies below the waterline are the causes of those racial inequities. And that's what we need to figure out. Now, I'm going to leave this slide up as we go through the next section of examples. Now, I want you to remember, though, our definition of racism, right? That it was racist policies plus racist ideas that combine to produce racial inequities, right, that appear normal. Have you ever wondered why colleges and universities are still relying on a standardized exam that has for years not fairly evaluated the talents of low-income Black and minoritized students? Have you ever noticed the appalling lack of faculty of color on college campuses across the country? Have you ever noticed the small number of Black and Latin students in sciences and STEM disciplines? And have you ever thought about the number of Black and minoritized students who either drop out or are forced out of disciplines from which they might secure a high-paying job immediately after graduation and into disciplines that will not afford them the same security? Well, even if we did notice, we might have just said, just happens that way. No, decisions were made. And though those decisions were not meant to have race-based impacts, racial inequities exist unless we take seriously the demands we heard so clearly this past summer of racial reckoning. Then we will face another 40 years of minimum gain and maximum frustration and anger from our students whose demographic profile does not match the majority. Race in America is a problem. And for too long, diversity solutions have burdened those in the institution without the position or power to sufficiently deal with them. Too often, when senior white officials or faculty hear about the indignities suffered by minoritized members of their community, they express shock and surprise. Such excuses are far from acceptable, especially to people who have been suffering these kinds of daily assaults. It is though their excuses are a complicit agreement that racism exists and should be tolerated because it's not worth significant attention. There must be a way that everyone in the institution realizes the impact of racism. We must be able to see race and call its name. And I'll begin with me. When I first became an administrator, I had the wonderful opportunity of leading the Center for Multicultural Affairs. Our job was to make sure that Black and minoritized students were fairly admitted into the institution and that they were given every opportunity to succeed and graduate ready to take on the future. And we did that. We had retention counseling, we had subject area tutoring, a lending library, and so many resources for our students. I'm proud of what we were able to accomplish. Now, Maria took full advantage of the subject area tutoring. She saw her counselor regularly and took so many of our self-help courses, but it was not enough. You see, the diversity solution was to make the students ready for the institution. But through the lens of anti-racism, we're forced to ask, if so much was done to accommodate the students to the institution, how much did the institution change to accommodate the students? Now, I'm not asking anyone to lower standards or not teach students what they need to know, but I am saying we need to notice who's learning and who's not and make the change. For too long in higher education, we have used the veil of academic excellence to shield us from the demographically changing student body in front of us. To use a business analogy, which we absolutely hate in higher education, it is though we are looking at our 2021 students exactly the same as we looked at our students 20 and 30 years ago. Now, in business, that wouldn't happen. But in higher education, we call our reluctance to change tradition and blame the students for not being able to keep up. Maria wanted to learn. Instead of finding out what she could learn, we told her what she didn't learn. There are thousands of Marias in higher education today, playing an educational game that is rigged against them. It is time for the game to change. Now, it's not only in the classroom we need to be aware of racism, but also in our policies. Let's take the policy of requiring a certain GPA to get into a major. Well, for Black and minoritized students, many of whom may come from under-resourced and underfunded schools, the academic standards of a college like Villanova are daunting. Now, we have great evidence to show that these students make up the difference and graduate just fine. However, initially, these students as a group are denied an educational opportunity because of pre-existing racial disparities. So the policy is logical. The impact is racist. We need to find a more equitable anti-racist solution. Now, it's not just faculty and staff who need to be aware of racism. Students do too. So let me give you one last example. For years, Black and minoritized students have complained that they haven't been able to access the most prestigious clubs and organizations in Villanova. Now, it's not so much the overt racism here, but a subtler form of racism that privileges certain kinds of socio-cultural experiences, knowledge, and skills. Let's take this example. The student is asked the question, talk about your best summer vacation. Well, that question presumes that you've had a summer vacation or you've had experiences that you can talk about. So at a high level, the problem here is not with the students applying, but rather the limitation is on the part of the student leaders who have created a complex intercultural situation that they really are unaware of. So the solution is recognize that there's a problem. And next, be able to see and talk about race. Now, as I move to my conclusion, I must end with this very emphatic point. It is not the responsibility of one person or one office in the university to address issues of racism. We all have a responsibility, whether it's leading faculty searches, designing a course, or deciding whom to include in our study groups. We all have a role to play. We begin to eliminate racism when we make racism our problem. What happened to Maria is in the past. But in the future, we need to see our students not just as diverse, but rather as Villanovans, deserving of the best equitable education we have to offer. Now in Villanova, we claim community as a very special value to us. And as English majors around the world will go crazy when I say, community is not just a noun to me. It is an active verb. It is what we do. We can make Villanova more welcoming and more just by confronting issues of racism and inequity with the truth and love we also value. It is time for us all to shoulder the responsibilities of anti-racism. Diversity has done its work. Now it's time for us to do ours.